And when you think about our industry today, NVIDIA, which is the biggest company in the world, well, one of the top three, depending on what day you look at, how did it become the biggest company in the world? Gaming. It didn't actually get there because we were GPU mining or afterwards AI. That came much, much later. The foundation of NVIDIA was fast graphic cards. Why? Because I wanted to experience my game, which was for pleasure, joy, and entertainment in a better way, right? And that's why we have curved screens, that's why I have fun keyboards, like the entire ecosystem of gaming hardware, which is what? Virtual entertainment, right? The Ethereum value proposition for much of 21-22 was actually all NFTs, because the NFT market was exclusively sitting basically on Ethereum for the most part. I actually don't think the conversation is AI here. I think the conversation is around digital identity.
We are in Dubai with Crypto Newsy in partnership with Global Blockchain Show, taking place in December here in Dubai. And today I'm with Yat from Animoca that will be speaking there. Yat, welcome to the show. I would love to hear how you first got into the industry. I know this might be a very repetitive question that you get. Give me the fun story.
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. But yes, my origin story was really through CryptoKitties. It was actually our studio in Vancouver that was involved in building it in a way. And they actually worked with Axiom Zen, which later on basically spun out something called Dapper Labs, where we ended up becoming investors. That was our origin story. And really, I think the fun part about this was that we were basically breeding kitties on chain. Yeah. And of course, at that point, NFTs and ERC 721 were just like weird sort of terms that people hadn't really heard of. And basically just happily breeding cats. And then to see people buying them was kind of already, it was already kind of mind-blowing when people are just doing that in that sense. And we already in the gaming industry have people that are trading skins and, trading accounts. So that's actually not that strange. But to see it at that pace and speed and velocity and transparency, that was quite fascinating. I think it was like $30 or $40 million of volume of trading, which then broke Ethereum. And I think most famously back then, because Ethereum hadn't scaled that well yet, a lot of people were also complaining and very, very angry at like CryptoKitties because you're messing up my trades. That's wrong. This is not what Ethereum was built for, blah, 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 blah. Very similar to all the Bitcoin guys who don't like ordinals. It's kind of same thing and same thing, same cycles. But yeah, that was my crypto origin story. I mean, I did, I guess, get my first crypto, I think, through a Doge faucet, maybe sometime earlier before that. But that was really for fun, and that wasn't serious, right? I think the NFT phase, basically starting with CryptoKitties, then basically with like Sandbox and our investment in Axie and so on, that was actually much more substantial and much more closer to what we wanted to do because we were a game company. And as a game company, this idea of having true digital ownership with NFTs was actually a really, really sort of pivotal moment for us.
Yeah, we had actually Sebastian here this morning from Sandbox.
Yes.
And one of the questions we covered was, like a lot of people, it's at this moment in time think that, NFTs are dead, the Metaverse is gone forever. And we covered...
Not according to Mark Zuckerberg. He's still heavily trying to make it work. Yeah.
So I guess my question to you would be like, do you think it's just transforming? Because I feel like stuff in this industry sort of like comes back with a different name, but it's the same thing.
Yes, absolutely.
You think that's what's happening?
Absolutely. So first of all, I would say that NFTs back in 21, 22 are meme coins today. Many of the constructions of the ideas that we have with NFTs, that in fact they're cultural and they're social with some economic value, exactly the same narratives as with meme coins. The only difference is that it's a little bit more economical, actually a lot more economical with meme coins, and maybe a little less cultural, but still has a culture value. Like when you hold a meme coin, there is a cultural, social aspect. It's not just economic capital. It is also a kind of social capital, which is what NFTs represent. But what's also interesting now, as you may have noticed, is in the same way that NFT projects started issuing their own tokens, right, as a way to expand their audiences, actually the meme coins are issuing their own NFTs to basically create a kind of, let's call it distinction between the audiences. And this is actually, I think, part of the natural way that we look at sort of our human equation when we think about sort of what do we value. We value ultimately cultural, social, and symbolic capital more than economic capital. Economic capital is base. We need that for our basic income, survival, that kind of stuff. But once you reach a certain amount of money, it's not about the money. It's actually about what money can give you. What status does it have? What respect do you have? Do you have love and friendship? Are you actually able to self-actualize? Are you actually able to create your fullest potential? That's where you want to go for. And money is a means to that end, but it is not the end in itself. And I think this is basically what NFTs represent. In the same way that people buy a Birkin bag, or they buy a Rolex watch, or they buy a Lamborghini, they don't do that because of the utility. For instance, people don't buy a Rolex watch to tell the time. There's much cheaper, economical, and frankly, better ways to do that, right? Yeah. And you also don't buy a Lamborghini as a form of transportation, even though that's actually what the utility is. It's all related to status. And I think with meme coins, it's the same. Meme coins are generating a class of people that are generating wealth. Remember, in Web3, most of the wealth is new wealth. And then you want to basically distinguish yourself in that wealth. So what's the difference between someone who has 1 million meme coins and someone who has 2 million meme coins? Some value, but when you go from 2 million meme coins to 3 million meme coins, it's kind of the same thing in the real world. When you call someone a millionaire, he's a millionaire. Is he 2 million, 3 million, 5 million? Doesn't matter. He's a millionaire. That's your label. So how does he distinguish himself? Well, I have a Picasso, or I bought this special violin, or I live in this neighborhood. I'm in Beverly Hills. And these are ways in which you actually determine your social rank and your social status, which is how we generally sort of think of NFTs. So I think they're kind of part of the same pool. And the other thing I would also say when people talk about the metaverse, a lot of people look at the metaverse in the view of what Mark Zuckerberg wanted the metaverse to be, because he renamed the company Meta. And so many people comment about the metaverse with the failing of Facebook's failing, not actually what the metaverse is. And to us, the metaverse is basically what's happening in Web3. People playing Web3 games, people making income, millions of people basically being able to sort of have almost like jobs, virtual employment, actually, being sort of those who are unbanked have now become banked through crypto. Like that to us is actually what the meaning of the open metaverse really is. It's not actually VR goggles. The VR goggles is only one part of that, but it's actually not the meaning of the metaverse.
Do you think it's coming back on a different shape?
Well, I think it's coming already back in a completely different way. Because, for instance, when you think about what's happening in the whole meme coin space, when you think about what's happening, like I fully expect, for instance, meme coins to be launching their own metaverses and their own games as part of creating utility for their ecosystems. They're kind of social in their construction, right? At the end of the day, there's only so much sort of mimetic that you can have from just the token itself. People will want to start doing stuff with it. I would argue that even things like Solana and Ethereum, they may have developers building on it, but actually a lot of people who are just holding it ended up basically building stuff on top of it to create different areas of value that are mostly cultural in context. Right? I mean, when NFTs first launched in Ethereum, which was driving a lot of that attention, the Ethereum value proposition for much of 21-22 was actually all NFTs, because the NFT market was exclusively sitting basically on Ethereum for the most part. And with meme coins, because meme coins are generally more sort of transacting on Solana, that's actually where Solana's value is coming from in terms of all the transactional value that's happening there in a similar type of space, right? So it's kind of where that part of the social and cultural capital resides at that moment in time. And I think we can see these dynamics.
Okay, so when just before we close this, when you say that, so the meme coin would then open a world. An example that would come to my mind would be, for example, like the founder of Lil Miquela launching the token Flavia, sort of like creates the conditions for that. And I bet there is more worlds there. I don't know if you had something else in mind when you mentioned this.
No, but I mean, I think the fact that, for instance, if you look at some of the more older meme coins, like for instance, whether it's SHIB or Doge, people are now building applications and games. And why did they do that?
Oh, yeah.
Right? And they're not, so we don't have to talk about the ones that are more recent. They're obviously in, let's call it the birth stage, right? And we don't know where it's going to go. But the ones that are more established, what they have? What they have is they have a community. They have a network that you can now avail yourself to. And that's where the value comes from. The value doesn't come from the price itself. The value comes from the community. And what is a community? The community is the network. And if you have a deep and strong network effect that is very, very solid, then it starts to make sense to start investing in that. And I think this is generally how we look at token ecosystems. And it's actually something that we can now see with the development of meme coins, very similar to NFTs. For instance, say what you will about the price of Bored Apes. It's gone, it's come down from its height, but it's still much higher than its original price, which was only hundreds of dollars, right? It's still, I think floor price is like $30,000 or $40,000 for a Bored Ape.
Yeah.
That community is worth building on. There is something there. There's an audience that is worth reaching to. And therefore, it makes sense for you to own a Bored Ape and to build a business that uses a Bored Ape, because that customer base could be a revenue source for you, right? It's not that different.
What do you think of Murad's meme coin supercycle theory? Are you aligned with it? What's your opinion?
Well, first of all, I do think, and it kind of also depends who's going to win the election
in
the US.
No, I get it.
But I do think that meme coins in and of itself are here to stay. And I do think that there's a more rapid acceleration when you look at, for instance, things that's happening with like AI, for instance, some of the recent examples with, basically Gotios Maximus and like all these type of sort of new projects and ideas that are emerging. But also there's going to be a dilution of attention, which is not that different from, technology companies, startups, fashion, whatever that is. When there's an idea and then it becomes more easier to launch. Now, to me, the launch of meme coins is a little bit like websites, 25 years ago, right? Or blogs, after that, or, Reddit subgroups.
Anyone can now do it.
Yes, anyone can now do it. Or like, sort of KOLs, for instance, or, the idea of an influencer.
There's so many influencers.
There's so many
now.
today, but before there was really only a few, right? And to be one, you had to have a certain type of level of quality and followers. And now anyone can do it because the tools are there for you to do it, whether it's on TikTok or Instagram. So this kind of mass amateurization, which has always been a trend, right? This mass amateurization actually opens up the opportunity. That's the good side, but also basically dilutes the attention in the classic sense, which means that you have to find better ways in which you can draw that attention to you. And so new innovations are being built around that. What's interesting though about Web3, which is not the case in Web2, because there was never a way to really do that, the financial ecosystem was really a measure to, was really a derivative output of your attention. So if I had lots of followers, I can maybe sell advertising, or I can be hired by someone to do a promotion. But that's a derivative output. It's not directly related to the attention you generate. But in Web3, they're tied to each other because the price itself becomes the attention. So in other words, if a token does well, right, whether it's your meme coin or project you're supporting, that actually gives you a sense of attention that you wouldn't normally have in Web2. Like for instance, if a game is launched in Web2 and it does $1 billion in sales, nobody cares. I mean, the gamer wouldn't buy the game because it made $1 billion, right? He buys the game because other people say it's fun and it looks like fun and there's a social community. But in Web3, if the token reaches $1 billion, I need to pay attention, right? Right? It's a completely different type of attention, or it's an added dimension of attention. And in the old days of the App Store, I'm not sure if you remember, because they don't do this anymore, and they didn't do it because they didn't like it. We used to have top grossing. So when you were looking at the App Store, and maybe you look very young, so you probably don't remember that.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Tell me about
But
it.
anyway, people would find what applications to download based on how well it did financially. So the top grossing chart, right? And it was part of the leaderboard. If you search some of the old app stores,
Product Hunt or something.
it's kind of like a product hunt, except it was just based on your financial performance. In other words, if many people paid for it, then you were ranked up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it was called top grossing.
Okay.
That was the definition. And people would discover apps based on top grossing because that was their way to determine, if many people are buying it, then maybe it's successful, right? Or maybe it makes sense. And in retail, we kind of do that as well. If the product does well, then we put it in the front of the store so it can sell more. But also you as an end user are now given the endorsement by some third party that says, this is a top seller, right? I mean, when you go into a store, whether it's virtual or physical, and you see top seller, what's your first thinking? Oh, it must be good somehow, right? That's the marketing. Whether it is or isn't, you don't know. But with top grossing or with prices in the token, that's actually a real-time validation. And that has now become in the forefront in Web3 and tokenization that didn't really exist before.
The industry goes through cycles and narratives, and it's constantly changing. And for some people, it's just playing catch up, and you're constantly on crypto Twitter and like searching and trying to figure out where to look at. And even for the people that have been in the industry for a while, this is still the dynamic. One question would be, will this ever change? And the second that is kind of paired, so I feel like you could answer them alongside, would be, how can retail navigate this without being chronically online?
Okay, so first, I don't think this will ever change.
Okay.
So just as a reality check. And the reason why this won't ever change is because humans are subject to this type of constant change anyway. I think it's part of our nature, right? And the only thing is that with, and this isn't related just to Web3. It's the fact that we're online all the time. And so if you look at the finance world, we used to have breaks. On Sundays and weekends, the stock exchange would stop working. We would stop trading at 5 p.m., right? You start at 10 a.m., right? So there was a cycle which wasn't natural. It was just something that someone imposed as a structure to make it easier to administer. And so we thought that was maybe the world order. But actually, when you think of it from a naturalistic sense, we're still growing, we're still doing stuff, we're still active. Things don't stop just because time stops. It doesn't change. But if there's one thing that's constant, it's change. And that's actually always part of our nature. So I don't think we can expect that. It's just much more in our face and much more sort of directed because it happens all the time. And it's also because we live in a capitalist framework, right? So from the perspective of capitalism, actually capitalism is one of its core features is actually volatility, which I think a lot of people don't like because they say, oh, it's going up and down, whatever. But the reality is that when we look at, for instance, just the employment market, if you were to count and draw on a chart, the number of people that get fired every week and hired every week, it wouldn't be a straight line. It would be totally choppy, right? Because actually that's what happens. But when you look at a government statistic, it says 2% unemployment, right, for the year. You kind of have in your mind a mental model that is kind of a straight line or it's kind of stable, but it's anything but stable. I mean, just think about how many businesses shut down and open, right? In Hong Kong, for instance, we have thousands of restaurants that close every year and that open every year. So it might seem like there's a similar number of restaurants. I will never go hungry because there's always a restaurant to eat, but it's not always the same restaurant because it keeps cycling out. That's the nature of the volatility, right? So I think there is a general sort of state that was always going to be change. Now, one thing that is why AI agents become helpful is that they become filters in where we can start translating and understanding the world around us. Because before, we would have only single news sources, like a newspaper or radio or maybe TV. And so we could process that. But now we need people to advise us. In this case, AI can process that. Information used to be organized like in things like Google. I would go to Google, I would search something. It would give you the information in a way that you can process, but you still have to come to your own determination. Now, basically, AI will just help filter that for you and then basically output that for you. But I'm afraid to say that change will be ever constant and will be more rapid.
Looking at analytics and data is always like exciting to me because I like seeing how like having like full view of what's going on. And I had Alex here earlier also from Nansen. And one thing I discussed with him because he was telling me like how you can track like how the meme coins are performing, who has the best score in terms of investment. So I thought all of this stuff was really fascinating. One thing I mentioned to him that he should add to Nansen was the ability to understand where the traction came from, even if it's something silly. And one thing I referenced was, for example, there's this K-pop star that launched a song recently called APT. I don't know if you've heard of this. And obviously Aptos went out that day. And there's no way to correlate it, but some people would have said it like it was related. So a way of like seeing, of course, like by the time it's up, you're probably already too late, but to understand the correlation. Do you get what I mean?
I know.
Do you think there's going to be more there's going to be more obvious ways of like tracking these things?
Well, the moment it becomes obvious, it'll become non-obvious very quickly. Because what happens is that when an idea is fresh, there's a premium to novelty, like a way to discover or an idea. For instance, we were very supportive of gaming, still are. And when we sort of started talking about the Web3 gaming narrative, really in 2018, nobody thought it was going to be big. And then in 21, everyone was doing it, right? And now we have thousands of Web3 games, and we will have many more. And I think that's good for the industry. But now the way to stand out is no longer based on you're a Web3 game. You have to stand out in different areas because the novelty of just being the Web3 game isn't powerful enough. And I think that's exactly what's happening in all industries. There's a point where there will be a natural point of saturation. And then from that, you have to innovate, which is the whole beauty of it, to become competitive against that pool of companies or businesses or individuals that are kind of doing the same thing. You were a novelty when you were a YouTuber. And now everyone's a YouTuber. And so you have to do other things and be maybe better or more talented or maybe more creative or certain things in order for you to basically build and gain that attention. So I think I think it's sort of the natural thing here, right? Now, can you predict these things? So this to me is the mimetic and the nature of who we are, which is that we are creatures. I think I forgot who named the term, but he described humans as homo narrans, as in we're narrative creatures. We live on stories, right? Our entire interactions of everything we do in human life is based on some element of storytelling. Even money is a story, right? It's a kind of fiction. Politics is a fiction, right? Religion, all these things, true or not, these are things that are stories that are told that we can't prove that mean something to us. When you even think about things like liberty or freedom, our ideas of property rights and why we should have maybe individualism as opposed to collectivism, these are all stories that are actually not based on some kind of scientific evidence per se, but they speak to us. And I think this is where things like meme coins become really interesting because they bring up the memetics that speak to us and show that there's demand for it. So, in the example of obviously, the song and Aptos, that's just maybe a lucky coincidence. And that happens, there is chance around that, but I wouldn't say there's something so correlated around it. But for instance, when you look at dogs versus cats, right? There's a very interesting thing where when you talk about meme coins, dogs just seem to be doing better than cats. Right? You kind of go, why is that? Right? Whereas when you look at the internet, the classic internet, actually cats were generally more popular memes than dogs, right? And there's zero correlation between them, except that particular audience, all it tells you is that particular audience that is in Web3 somehow have a stronger affinity to dogs in some form or fashion that has become a cultural phenomena and now has become lore. And that has become part of our storytelling in Web3 that somehow dogs are more popular than cats or rabbits or turtles or any other creature, right? And that's how people create these myths and lores and legends. And now they just become part of even if we know it's a joke, it becomes part of our narrative when we start, joking about dogs with hat or dogs with this or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's part of that cultural construction. And we do this, by the way, in the physical world as well. And these memes are things that are based on the cultural moment of our time. So if I look at, for instance, our generation, I'm a little older, our memes were superheroes, for instance, right?
Superheroes?
Right, superheroes were the memes, there was Superman and Spider-Man, and those are sort of heroes of the time, and those were the pop culture items that mattered. If I had asked, and if I told my parents that we would be basically worshiping, men and women in tights, right? Jumping off the streets and basically having bright colored costumes, they would just think we're crazy, right? There's no correlation for them to be able to identify that because it wasn't part of their story narrative, right? So again, I would say it is very narrative driven. And in that sense, I would say just as we have in with companies and with books and movies and entertainment and culture, which is why we think culture is so important, this is all around culture, is that the ones who tell the best stories and the ones who are able to capture people with those stories are actually naturally the ones who will probably succeed better at this, because that's actually what the phase of we're in, which is a lot of storytelling.
And now, we have even the AI tokens with code and everything. Mm-hmm. But let me transition this conversation to AI.
Sure.
Because I've recently seen that. Have you been following WorldCoin?
Oh, of course. Yes. Yeah.
Did you see were you at the last thing?
I wasn't at the last thing though.
Yeah.
But yes, yeah.
But have you heard of it?
Of course. Yes.
Yeah. So the world token.
Mm-hmm.
WorldCoin, I find it's very polarizing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Would you agree?
I agree. Especially because you got to scan your iris, and there's a whole sort of quasi-dystopian perspective on this, which we can talk about a bit later.
Yes, yeah. And I feel because a bit of context. So, for example, my mom would be on the side that is against it. My mom is early Bitcoin maxi stereotype.
Yes,
and this division, even if they were to, because they have the mind. They're they have a strong willpower, let's put it this way. Even if they were to prevail, what does this mean for the society? Is there a Black Mirror effect here? Because obviously not wanting to make AI any dark, because I know technology is always great and there's always amazing things that come with it, but it unlocks something.
Yeah, so I actually don't think the conversation is AI here. I think the conversation is around digital identity.
Okay.
Right. And I think while AI is an element of that, I think digital identity is really at the core of what both WorldCoin and what with Mochaverse in our case or others are trying to solve. which comes down to this question of testing whether you're real or not, and whether you are deserving of something, as in your reputation, and also, whether, in the case of Web3 in particular, you could be online and you could not be human, and you have to test that. And so there's an element around, and I think this is what blockchain could be interesting. And I'm not saying that that's what WorldCoin is doing. But for instance, if you want to test whether you're human as a first step of whether we should be building something with you or whether we should trust you, you can actually use this technology to determine whether you're human by scanning your eyes. And there's other protocols like Humanity Protocol, they do the same thing, but you just look at their palm. So it's not as intrusive. You can just look at the palm on your phone and prove that you're human. And then afterwards, it could destroy that data. So it never stores that. But in the case of WorldCoin, that's not quite the same, because it's very impractical for you to basically, retesting your your eyeball, because unless you're walking around with a device all the time just staring into it, right, it's not going to work. So it has to be stored somewhere. And I think this is what most people are fearful, is that, okay, even if it's safely stored, actually could it be abused, could it, all that kind of stuff. But I think the longer term picture is around how do you build more trust in this type of network economy, because and I think in Web3, we got very, very sort of focused around, the trustless, permissionless nature, which is true. But in so doing, we are, I think, we are conflating anonymity with our need for privacy. So I think most people don't need to be anonymous. They just want to have privacy. Because if we are in a society where everyone is anonymous, right, then actually nothing works. Because I can't trust you, which is why in Web3, we have to put collateral for everything. Right. And as a result, I'm imagining a society where every person, even business relationships you're supposedly working in on a regular basis, is a new person or is an anonymous person that you can't really know. You can't build a relationship. You can't build a reputation. And I think the answer towards that is, how do you build frameworks that actually allow you to build digital reputation? And we had this sort of interesting conversation today at the event on stage, because I think digital reputation isn't just human reputation. It could be an AI reputation too. So for instance, if you're a token holder and a token investor, whether you are a human or a robot kind of doesn't matter. What matters more is what you do with it. And if I can actually know whether you have a good or bad reputation, for instance, do you dump your token on day one? Or are you accumulating? Or are you creating value in the network? Does it matter if you're human or machine, actually? Would you actually be willing to give tokens and an airdrop or more value with an AI that will do good in your ecosystem? He can still have a reputation, even if he isn't human, right? But I think it all comes down to the big question of, when you're building a token network, you're building a network effect. Actually, everything, even when you're building a game, you're building a network effect. And to build a quality network effect, you need to know whether the users are quality users. That's, it doesn't matter whether you are selling, luxury handbags, or whether you're selling soda, or whether you're selling tokens. None of it, everything's the same. How do I get to a quality customer base? And what's the ratio of quality customer base? It's your reputation. How do I reach the person with a reputation? Right now, we try to estimate it. Oh, someone who owns a Lamborghini has money, and therefore I try to target that audience because I think it's the right match. But I actually don't know anything about you. Whereas in Web3, with the digital identity, like what we have with Mochaverse, you're actually now able to sort of accrue that reputational value. And then from that reputational value, people can then give benefits to you, just like they do it in real life. Like, hey, you're a famous podcaster. I'd like to be on your show. How did you get to that point? Purely on reputation. And then it unlocks essentially sort of all the unsecured credit markets, which are all entirely really reputation markets. So I think, it's a long-winded way to say that things like proof of humanity, which in some ways WorldCoin is actually doing with sort of this dystopian way of measuring your eyeballs, is really trying to determine whether you're a real human and take transactions from there. The fact that you get paid tokens to look at your eyeball, to me, that the dystopian part is, well, what are you doing with the data, right? Whereas actually with a digital identity, in a way, you could say that data belongs to you, and the reputational benefits of that accrue to you over time. That's something that I think for the time being, I don't think WorldCoin is addressing in this way, but it tries to answer maybe a similar question, except maybe in a slightly more controlling way.
Yeah, they're trying to get like as many people as possible, because if you get the people, then it's easier to get anyone to come in there. It's almost like an L1.
Well, it is, but it is also building a network effect. It's like saying, if everyone's doing it, then I may as well do it, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But I think the true test will it be valuable for the person who did it? And I think this is where, unless you're building a reputation layer on top of it, that's very hard.
Yeah, the way I see it though is more similar to someone creating their Instagram account, like they are the product.
Yes.
I think that's how I see it at the moment. To go back to my initial question where I paired this WorldCoin with the AI is because obviously like someone like directing both companies.
Yes.
I see that like also inevitably most companies will have AI integrated to some level.
Oh, everywhere.
So I can imagine like something like this that is proof of humanity, having some AI machine, whatever the take there becomes. It is very dystopian. Like there's something on its core that might trigger obviously like a new way of living. And what that means for us, obviously, my stance here is more like for those who fear it. Obviously, there's the good side of it, which is like our lives become so much easier. I use ChatGPT endless hours a day. It replaced Google. It replaced a lot of apps in my phone. I talk with it like similar to the guy on the movie Her.
Yes.
It is very limited compared to the movie.
Of course.
But you can feed it information because it has limited memory.
Yeah.
I feed it like a PDF.
Yes,
so
and
it
then
has
you can talk
more
to
memory.
him about the PDF. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But there's ways to go around it. The point being, if this conversation was tied to my identity and then reflected things from their conversation back, let's say, some concerns with health would go to my doctor. Some concerns with finance would go to my bank. This would be I'd be very self-aware, like talking here.
But I think a good application for blockchain would solve this, because with zero knowledge proof, you can actually attest to something that maybe your doctor needs to know without necessarily needing to know your name or having all that background. And I think the big risk that people have when it comes to centralizing the data store is that if there's one company that knows everything about you, which is kind of what we have with Facebook, Google, or Apple, that's actually when you need to have these policies in place, because someone has to enforce the fact that you're not abusing the data in this dystopian manner. But actually, if this is in blockchain and you have the permissions and you are the one that's determining who can see whatever through zero knowledge proof. For instance, an example would be if I want to demonstrate that I'm actually a good user, and not only that I'm human, but I've done many good deeds. I don't have to reveal all of my on-chain activity. You just need someone to attest that reputation. And I could even launch a new wallet that could be anonymous or pseudonymous, but that new wallet has been attested by blockchain to be part of your ownership of that wallet, which means that you have a good reputation that you can benefit from over time. Same way, though, that if you do something bad, that reputation can go in a negative way back to you, even if I don't know your name or who you are, right? So that to me actually is a powerful way, in which we can sort of leverage the privacy, but not the complete anonymity, like in terms of that nobody should have a way in which they can hold you accountable for, because I think that's the point. Reputation makes people accountable to themselves and society.
Yeah.
When you have reputation, you will fight to defend it. You will actually invest in it. And it's something that accrues because that's one of the most valuable things, if not the most valuable thing to you in life, right? And I think this is what's possible in Web3, but we haven't been able to really do that until essentially with the DIDs.
Yeah, I guess the most concerning thing on the setup would be governments, because under different governments, this would play out differently. So
sure, but I think at least when you look at laws like GDPR in Europe, I think it solves a lot of problems for them, because GDPR isn't about people having data that they can manage themselves. It's the fact that someone else is managing your data. And inadvertently, because of that, now it's very difficult for a startup to be in a similar space, because the type of legal and compliance work you need to be in is so restrictive that it really only benefits the big companies, because they're the ones who can hire the lawyers and they're the ones who can basically do all this GDPR compliance stuff. But if you actually were going to do this on a ZK knowledge sort of blockchain basis, then actually the user owns the data and he has rights and controls over it. And the platform never has actually all that information.
Mm-hmm. What does this mean for, let's now go into gaming.
Sure.
What does this mean? Like all these new technologies I feel like everything is going like really fast.
Of course.
Because I feel like crypto is going fast, but when AI picked up, it just feels like every update is massive and it's in such a...
It'll accelerate even more.
Short amount of time. And so like so my brother is a gamer. He lives with my parents.
I think
That's all he does.
I think most young people are gamers, but yes.
And like he's still not playing anything in crypto. I keep taking stuff from conferences. Hey, here's like a code for you to play here for free.
Yes.
Take this thing. What do you think of this game? I've asked for advice. Like, what do you think of this game? He's very skeptical, and it maybe because of the environment. My brother lives in Portugal, and I think nothing against Portugal, but it's saying like if he lived in SF, let's say, like maybe he would be more open-minded to these things.
Sure.
Also personality. But I do wonder, like, at what point, the day my brother starts playing a crypto game, I will be very, very bullish, because it's going to be a sign that it has come. He's like the late adopter, I believe.
Yes.
He plays really weird games. He's not the type that would be like, on the coolest, latest. But I do wonder, like, what will take for this major shift in the gaming.
So first, to understand what Web3 gaming is today is to not compare it to Web2 gaming, because the majority of Web3 gaming, the vast majority of Web3 gamers today are not gamers the way that most people think about it. So it's not that, there's about 3.4 billion people that play games today all over the world. That's pretty big, right? But that means there's also roughly 2.8 billion people, which is, almost half of the world's internet, that are not playing games. And it is that 2.8 billion that are actually moving into Web3 games. It is not the 3.4 billion who play games today that are playing Web3 games. And now why is that? That's because the type of gameplay that Web3 games predominantly have today, which is around ownership of assets, and a form of financial value attached to it, and token economies, is a very different type of metagame that traditional gamers are not playing today. Now that's not to say that they're not converging. They are, and I'll get to that. But it's to understand that you can't take the lens of your brother to say, why is gaming not working? Because it's a different gamer. The person who's playing Axie Infinity, or who's playing Gamey or Hamster Combat, they're not the person who's playing Call of Duty, right? Right? Or even Roblox, for that matter. Right? There might be a small intersection, but that's not the majority. And by the way, it's not only because there's money involved or not. There's many other types of games, like real money gaming, where you can make money as well. It's the fact that that gamer is just a different type of gamer. In 2009, 2010, the gaming industry had only 500 million users, and they were all playing PC or console, and the industry was stuck. And if you look at the sales figures of the PlayStation 3, it was a disaster. Nobody wanted to buy another console because the market was saturated.
Yeah.
What actually grew the market, and why the PlayStation 4 eventually became a big success, wasn't that there were more hardcore gamers. It was mobile gaming. Through the smartphone, they brought in a new type of gamer, and that made it into the billions. People playing Angry Birds and Candy Crush, and also social games like Farmville, whatever, on the web.
Farmville, yeah.
And a percentage of these gamers, not all of them, a percentage of these gamers were like, oh, you know what? I like games. And, Angry Birds.
They weren't gamers.
They weren't gamers before. And then they said, well, I like this. What can I play that's a little bit more intense? Then they moved down to mid to hardcore gaming. Right? So the market expanded because of the new paradigm. It didn't expand because the gamer in itself grew. There was a new sort of type of way of playing games. And the innovation wasn't that it was mobile, because the Nintendo Game Boy was already there before. It was the fact that through the swipe of a finger, you could now play a game. Because for most people, it was difficult. Like my mom wouldn't be able to play a first-person shooter. It would just be too difficult for her. But now, just swiping some fingers on Candy Crush, and she can be a pro gamer, right? So it's really back down to, it was the mass amortization of gameplay, and that's how you brought billions of people in. But now, with Web3 gaming, you have a kind of passive participation in the gaming economy simply through ownership. If I own the token, I can farm some stuff, or I can do whatever. It's a very different type of engagement style, right? The clicker gaming genre it remains a very popular genre in mobile games. Right? It's of course not, when people talk about tap to earn, very similar to play to earn, there is a negative vibe to it because it is overused. But that's not to say there is value in it. It's just that, as everything goes, when it was first innovated, everyone's like, wow, that's amazing. And then when 100 companies are doing it, oh my goodness, it's like, everyone's copycatting and it's being overused. But that's a normal cycle. We just talked about that earlier. It's exactly the same thing. Anyway, my point on this is that in Web3 gaming, there's a new audience that's coming through. And that new audience is learning about gaming in a different context through Web3 and ownership. But the number is relatively small in comparison to the existing Web2 gamers. But there's new games coming out like Off the Grid from Godzilla, which is also one of our portfolios, that are now the type of games where you can actually go to a traditional gamer and say, oh, that's actually something that someone who plays a first-person shooter would consider playing. And it takes 3 to 5 years to make a really good game. so that they can compete with those. And we're now getting to that point. So we're very bullish about where it's going to go in the next couple of years, because all these great games that have raised all this money and are building, like the off the grids of the world, the Gonzillas of the world, they're all coming out and actually being able to sort of release to the market. So I think we're seeing a sort of merging of that, where the traditional gamer is getting into gaming in a very abstracted way. So they don't know that they're really in a wallet. They're playing the game for fun. There's a token involved, but they don't really have to trade it. And then a percentage of them may end up rolling out. I don't know if you know, but CSGO, for instance, one of the oldest games out there, has a very active skin trading market.
Okay.
Right. And that's something that is controlled by the company itself. But actually, it's not that every person trades the skins. Most people play the game, and a percentage trades the skins. And we see very similarly that will happen in Web 2 as well, that there will be a large number of people that will play Web 3 games, but a percentage of them, which could be meaningful, maybe 20, 30%, will also then go into the financial elements, which then gives them a deeper element of engagement and gameplay that they couldn't have had before.
I find it interesting, the gaming stuff, because when I was in high school, I had a boyfriend that spent many hours playing video games. He played World of Warcraft.
That's pretty universal, I think. Yeah,
yeah,
but yes,
and he was like into the skins and killing the boss, whatever was happening there.
Yes,
I'm not
probably doing raids. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
yes.
He would spend so many hours, and his mom was very strict, compared him with all her friends' son, whatever. And I just remember when I got into crypto, I made the comparison in my mind that if he was making money playing the game, the comparison would have been that he is the best out of the group.
Yes.
But because it wasn't leading to anything monetary, it was just a waste of time, and he wasn't studying and so on. So I do wonder, if this is going to change, and for these kids that love playing and really are good at it, like a sport.
When you have esports already. But esports isn't the real measure. I would say it's only one element. To me, actually, what gaming does is it enhances and develops skills for you digitally that now you can measure and then can give you an attribution. So I remember it was a very, very, very famous story back in the day where people were looking at guild leaders in World of Warcraft as potential for being managers. Why? Because when you're a guild leader, you have to organize dozens of people from all over the world. And it doesn't matter if he's a CEO or there's a teacher or some little kid, and say, at this time, at 3:00 in this area, we're all going to meet here, and we're going to go attack this beast, and we're going to do a strategy. You're the healer, you're the fighter. That's a lot of coordination. I mean, that's basically event planning and management and time planning and strategic thinking that, frankly, a lot of people don't know how to do. And this is not someone that was trained to do it. It wasn't like the CEO was a guild leader. It was maybe a teacher or maybe even a kid. And these are skills that you can then use in real life. But in gaming, it's stuck in the gaming world, and you can't attest to that outside. But in Web3, through the ownership of things, actually now you can build that reputation and transfer it. So I actually think gaming will become much more valuable in our life, because now we can take these things in Web3 as a form of a badge of success and then apply it as a kind of credit score. Now, I don't mean the credit score has to be purely financial, but for instance, if I was able to prove all my hours of gameplay and what I learned and did in those games, they may appear to be wasteful, but I learned about, economic systems. I learned certain skill sets. I actually learned about a lot of logic thinking, like a whole bunch of things that actually come through the gameplay that you wouldn't think of. Like people used to hate Minecraft, and now people love Minecraft because they realize that, with things like redstones and so on, you're actually able to learn a basic form of programming and logic switching and also socializing. Like all these skills actually come to mind. People learn through play. Mm-hmm. Historically, humans have always learned through play. It's just that our play has evolved, right? This idea that we can only physically play. I mean, it's kind of like saying, well, you should play like we did in the Middle Ages. Why, right? Life has changed, right? And also we often look at things from our lens as well, because maybe our parents did certain types of, let's call it athletic activities, which are still important. But the reason why you do these activities in terms of the form of play are not maybe as important as they are in today's society as they were before. But as parents, we often look at it from the lens of our own experience. So we don't, for instance, understand, certainly my generation of parents wouldn't understand that actually a child who is engaged in Minecraft or in Roblox or in Sandbox, for instance, that it is a creative endeavor and it gives them the imagination to do a lot of things. It's just in their head, as opposed to maybe having a pen and pencil and draw something, because maybe they're not a good painter or good with their pencil, but they can still think creatively in that environment, right? It's just that it's a world they don't understand. There's an interesting study that I was looking at Pew where I was I was giving a talk about this, and 91% of kids play games, which is unsurprising, of course. But then the same survey asked the question, how many people actually engage, or parents engage in video games with their kids? And the answer is, it was like I think it was like 10 or 20%. It was like a very small percentage, meaning parents do not engage with the children in video games. But when it comes to sports, they're all engaged, right? If I'm playing football, or for instance, I remember when I take my kids swimming, which is, I thought, a waste of time really, because I never see them because they're always underwater, right? And also, but you're there and you're participating and you're seeing them swim, or when they go to a sports competition, you watch them play the sports competition. But when they're when they're playing video games, we don't watch them, right?
Sitting
right,
watching,
exactly.
yeah.
Or participating and engaging with them. And so I think this is part of what creates this divide, because the parents aren't engaged in the same activity. And so it creates more of a generational divide that didn't happen before. But it doesn't mean that it's not actually valuable, useful. And I think with blockchain, you actually end up attesting your game performance across multiple games that you can then take on as your reputation. Frankly, I think if you have a certain type of achievements inside games, I think those are life achievements that you can prove to someone that you're good. In gaming worlds, you get kudos if you are one of the best players, or if you can shoot really fast, or do that kind of stuff. Just how we have it in real life. Like if you can hit a great shot in golf, or when you have a great shot in tennis, it's kind of the same thing.
It's an interesting comparison, given also nowadays people also live stream. So it's like the parents are not watching, but then they can like show it to the world. Two parts in the gaming ecosystem that I find personally interesting. One would be the gamification of things. So the Duolingos of education,
of course, yes.
Something that really fascinates me, and I'll tell you why. Because personally, I've learned how to play piano and how to speak fluently Italian because of gamification. And I do think that this is the natural way of self-education.
You learn through play.
You learn through play and through like really good applications. If you look at Duolingo, the way it's designed, it's the high quality of a gaming application. And till today, like if I just want to do something quick on my phone, I could just go on Duolingo, learn a bit of Chinese. Like I was in Singapore, just decided to learn a little bit with no intent of becoming fluent. And I think that this could be a reality. There's another part in gaming. Let's talk about this one first. What are your thoughts here? I
think gamification is already everywhere. If you think about, back during, DeFi summer, when everything, in a way, yes, it was finance, but it was a game, right? And it was playful, and everything was based on food and funny animals, whatever it was, right? Whether it was sushi swap or pancake swap or whatever it was, right? Like, these were all forms of that. Now, it speaks to, I go back to the point about that, we're narrative storytelling creatures. These are things that actually are fun and entertaining, and it's fun and entertainment that drives us forward. Like we don't do things purely for the utility. That's for survival. But once we reach a certain stage, we actually do it because we want to be creative, because that's how we entertain ourselves. We do it for fun things. Back even in the oldest of days, right? Think about just cave paintings and musical instruments, right? When we were sort of prehistoric men and women and doing whatever it is we were doing, once we started reaching a certain level of civilization, we didn't actually invent new machines. We created musical instruments out of bones, for instance, and we created cave paintings. And it wasn't for a pure utility. It was for what? Personal pleasure, for joy, right? And when you think about our industry today, NVIDIA, which is the biggest company in the world, well, one of the top three, depending on which day you look at, how did it become the biggest company in the world? Gaming. It didn't actually get there because we were GPU mining or afterwards AI. That came much, much later. The foundation of NVIDIA was fast graphic cards. Why? Because I wanted to experience my game, which was for pleasure, joy, and entertainment, in a better way, right? And that's why we have curved screens. That's why I have funny keyboards. The entire ecosystem of gaming hardware, which is what? Virtual entertainment, right? So I think that generally speaking, when it comes to this fun and personal joy is actually what drives human desire and innovation. And actually that is a driver for many of the things that we create and develop today, right? And so this is therefore, when you think about the engine of growth, that's what we need to drive for. Because at the end, what do we drive for ultimately? We're not driving just for utility, right? We're actually driving, well, like for instance, fashion. Like, if we're really only buying clothes for pure utility, we would only be wearing typically one type of clothing, and it would also be
Wearing the same thing.
Yeah, same thing, and it'd be easy to replace and whatever. But no, we buy different things with different colors, with different shapes, or we have tattoos, because ultimately these are all our own self-expressions of our own personalities that give us pleasure and joy.
The other area in gaming that I've been thinking about more recently, I'd say, is obviously like within games, there's social games. There's games that people have played, like, let's say, like in high school, you play like Truth or Dare and all these card games,
Sure.
Cards Against Humanity.
Yeah.
I do think that is a very different segment out of like gaming. Like I wouldn't say, because you could say like there's social in every game, and that is true. But I think that these social games are used to bring people together, and I'd say more like perhaps more for the interaction between women specifically. Like these games become really interesting, the interest in astrology and things like that. You
Sure.
could say that's a game in a way, like if you're like me and you don't really take it too seriously.
Yeah.
It is a game because you segment things. It's sort of like a play, like you're a Leo, I'm a Aquarius, whatever. I think this is a very predominant thing that has lived throughout time, and I wonder how it takes shape from here, because we could still like keep it a social spoken thing, but if we go into the metaverse and we have this virtual reality, then how does this take shape?
So maybe one way to think about it, and I'll quickly then later on maybe go into sort of how we think of game players in what's known as Bartle's model of gaming, because we actually have a quasi sort of psychological diagram as to how gaming is divided, how gamers are divided. But one way to think about gaming and gamification generally is that there are rules that are established that everyone plays together in. This could be chess, but this could also be things like don't cross when there's a red light. I mean, or when you go to a grading system to school, you have an A or a B or a C. They're actually all rules. So they're all games in a way. Some are better designed and some are badly designed, but they're still games.
Yeah.
And then we form a consensus around whether this is a game we like to play, whether this is a game that we think we're good at. And some of us are good at it and some of us are not. So we choose to be in this game, but, and this is very much true for real life, you might be good at the game of music, but you might be bad at the game of math, whatever that is, then you choose your path and you play within the rules of that game that ultimately is formed by the consensus of the people who play the same game. And that's where the social part comes together. Because we're playing the same game, we can now measure ourselves and understand our aptitude. And I think there's a very biological survivalist element around that is actually sort of makes sense. So gamification to me isn't just about the fun and entertainment. That's one element. It's really about rules of a certain game that we all follow in agreement and then reach a certain achievement that could be pleasurable, but might also just have an outcome that makes sense, like we see, for instance, in the world of education. Now, in Bartle's model, there are basically it's a quadrant of really sort of 4 categories of gamers. Well, actually, it's a bit more, but anyway. So you've got essentially the achievers, you've got the killers, which is like the 1%, right? You've got the adventurers, and then you've got the ones that are there basically for social. And what's interesting is that achievers and adventurers, between the two of them are roughly 20%, right? The killers are 1%, are very small, and the rest are all social. So meaning that people who play games are predominantly there for the social experience. Now, when you think of it from the gameplay standpoint, a gamer might come in because he wants the adventure or he wants to achieve. And then he drags his friends in. So if you talk to parents who, or if you talk to the kids who play games like Roblox, which is the #1 game in the world, by the way, but it's not nearly as good looking as like a Fortnite or, that type of game. You ask them, why are you playing the game? The answer will most likely be because my friends are playing it, right? That is actually the draw, and that's the pull, and that's basically a social network. And the achievers and the adventurers are actually almost like the ringleaders, right? They play the game because they like it's fun. They like it. It's fun, and then they bring their friends into that, and they become essentially, the glue that basically begins the formation of that. And that's actually a typical strategy that a lot of game companies apply, where they try to bring in those type of players because then they bring in their social network, and then it actually builds a real network effect.
They influence their network to come and play the game with them.
Yeah. That's not that different, from that content model. I forgot who designed it, but it was this whole idea of, how many people are actually writing content, how many people are just consuming it, how many people are just lurking. And, it's a kind of a similar thing where it's like 80-20 sort of, a Pareto principle.
It's really interesting. Do you have any hot takes for next year?
Oh, well, it kind of depends who wins the election. But, that aside, I think broadly macro, I think crypto is generally on a growth path. I think we can see today that it doesn't really matter which party wins in a way, because crypto has become a bipartisan issue. If we look at things like what happened, in Congress between FIT21 and SAP 121. And so I think that's obviously a very strong narrative going forward. However, that said, I think meme coins will continue to grow. I'm not saying that the value will necessarily grow, but the attention around them will continue to sort of proliferate in the same way that NFTs basically did that in 21, 22. And I think NFTs will make a major comeback. Not sure if it's in 25, but very soon, because again, the people who make money and value through essentially the cycle are going to be looking for the type of status and cultural goods that they sort of elevate them and give them a certain kind of status. And that to me is going to be in NFTs. Whether they are NFTs from the last cycle or whether they're new NFTs, that is up for debate.
Okay.
But my point is that it's kind of a little bit like fashion, for instance. And some of them become enduring. Yeah, I think it's going to come back. I think gaming will drive mass adoption. Obviously, we're big in the Ton ecosystem, so I think that's sort of another major narrative. And what I'm hoping for, which I think is harder, so I don't think it's a short-term cycle, to be fair. But what I really want to see is that education will take a front row in Web3. We have some projects that are looking to basically bring student loans on chain, right? And kind of like a PayPal model, in the sense that how PayPal basically opened up whole financial markets for students that were unbanked, right? And that's how they grew, for instance, and Venmo was the same. And now essentially with crypto rails, you can do something similar, except now you can also finance student debt, which is a big problem. It's a $2 trillion problem, for instance, that can now basically be better financed through basically a crypto rails with like DeFi yield and so on. So there are many interesting innovations that can develop from that. A little bit more boring, but actually very, very practical, and actually a mass onboarding tool, because that's part of our mission as well, is how do we mass onboard more people into Web3? And, if you start with students, that's a pretty good way to do it, we think.
Yeah, it'd be really cool to see happening. Some comments on the Ethereum not being as cool as it used to be. What's going on?
Well, I mean, first of all, Ethereum was very cool because of NFTs back in 21, 22. That's the cycle that it was going into. So its narrative isn't captured in the same way. That said, the Ethereum ecosystem is actually, I would say, as strong as ever. When you basically look at all of the L2s attached to it, whether this is Polygon or whether this is Optimism, Arbitrum, and frankly, even things like ApeChain, for instance, like they all connect into this ecosystem that helps it grow, right? So I do believe that those network effects will accrue more naturally and more freely over time. Does that mean that Ethereum will have the same type of value accrual than certain other monolithic chains? I don't know, but I don't know that it really matters, because for me, Ethereum will be the sort of in that ecosystem is kind of like the granddaddy chain, as it were. And it's the one that basically forms and people build on it still for value. But I would also say that its cool factor will come back when things like NFTs and other areas and other innovations are basically built on top of that. Again, I would say the Solana sort of hype, as it were, is really driven by meme coins, and the Ton one is really driven by Telegram. So they all have an anchor, right? And in some ways, I would say Ethereum is so distributed that you can't actually point to what the anchor is per se. But actually, in many ways, I think that value will, we're in a cycle where the utility and the narrative is more shifted to narrative than utility, right? Today. Yeah. That's definitely in our space. And so because it's so narrative driven, the underlying value comes more about the storytelling, broadly speaking, and its potential. And so when you do many, many things, which is what the Ethereum ecosystem is all about, it's doing 1,000 different things that you can't really pinpoint to. What is the one thing that you're known for? Like Solana, meme coins, Ton, Telegram, right? It's very easy to pinpoint and have Bitcoin, store value, like ETFs, whatever. But for Ethereum, it's so distributed, it's really hard to say which one is the one. And so in a market where narrative is a predominant sort of value generator for the time being, it feels lost a little bit, right? Because it's confusing. Why am I buying Ethereum? Or why should I have it? Because of this guy, that guy, right? But that's the whole point of decentralization, because eventually when the pendulum of utility starts to go more and more and more towards importance, which is what's happening already, then actually
I
that
see.
area is going to swing, I think, the Ethereum ecosystem in a different direction, because you have many more developers and many more applications that are built on top of it. At the end of the day, Ethereum still has the deepest TVL, right? And has most of the DeFi activity. These are things that matter.
I see that Ethereum has like the strongest core values than any other,
Yeah.
honestly. And I think just for that, they stick to it, whether it's a trend or not, like the classics
Right.
stay. What are your thoughts on the Bitcoin renaissance?
Well, I think the Bitcoin renaissance is really driven through the ETFs and institutionalization. And to me, the Bitcoin...
Is it going to wind down then?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think of Bitcoin as our reserve currency of Web3 for the time being. Basically, it's our gold, as it were.
Yeah, but beyond that, like, okay, I call the renaissance in the new phase of like wanting to build on Bitcoin, because there's people that say like Bitcoin is just store of value and that it has done what it does what it needs to do. It doesn't need more than that. And some other people would say that no, let's do everything on Bitcoin. Let's build. Let's do everything here.
So first, I would say that when there is an economy and the market value, then it makes sense to build on it. And Bitcoin is no different. So when you think of it in the perspective of Bitcoin as a nation, there's an economy that you can utilize. But where Bitcoin is weaker compared to other ecosystems, and this is where the price action starts to matter, is around whether people will spend it. So the issue is that the benefit of the Ethereum ecosystem is that people will spend their Ethereum, not just because of gas, because of this, because of that. The activity of spending Ethereum is in the culture. But the activity of spending Bitcoin is not in the culture. The culture of Bitcoin is to hold. And so if you're holding Bitcoin and you're not spending it, other than for transactions, then your mindset is different. It's kind of like you don't spend gold. You hold gold, right? The whole value proposition of it. So while I understand why you build on it, and there's an audience that utilizes it, where does the revenue stream come from? And so things like BRC20, runes, and so on are an element of that development. But when you really want to take it into the area where you want to make a real economy, where it becomes that sort of currency, as it were, then you need to be comfortable to actually spending it. And this is where it's interesting, because that's not the narrative that the Bitcoin maxis are on about, which is spend your Bitcoin on your favorite products and just keep doing stuff with it. Even though they would like to, they won't do it themselves, right? So there's a very different utility construction in the culture of Bitcoin for the time being. When you're buying a Bitcoin ETF, there's, what is it? Like, I think BlackRock has alone, 2% of the Bitcoin supply now is an ETF. That's not going to be spent, right? Mm-hmm. Right? So there is a different thing. So the fact that Ethereum at the time being hasn't caught up as that value element in some ways plays to its favor as a currency of exchange, because I'm willing to transact with it, because I don't view it in the same way of one thing that has to hold and increase in value. Because if I actually thought that Ethereum was just going to increase in value, in a rapid manner, then why would you sell it, right? So it's a different culture.
Yeah, that's I align with that a lot. I mean, knowing also that my mom being into Bitcoin, and I don't see her spending it anytime soon. And if she does, will be to get into real estate or something like this. So I see the behavior much different.
It's much more like gold, I think, for now. Yeah.
In my opinion on it, and I'm a little bit more backwards on this thing, but my opinion has been that we don't need to build on Bitcoin. I don't know. For everyone watching, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter, YSIU. I also have a Medium that I sometimes post on, but generally speaking, most of my activity is on Twitter /X under YSIU. And of course, if you follow Animoca Brands, our research, our Twitter, as well as our website, you'll get lots of information about what we do and how we think about the industry.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.